Folks, this is happening on so many different fronts. The Legal Defense Fund and Lambda Legal filed a federal lawsuit challenging 3 of Donald Trump's executive orders restricting civil rights and the ability of organizations to provide social and health services. Folks, this is an important issue because, again, what you're seeing them trying to craft policies that are detrimental to marginalized citizens. Demetria McCain is the Director of Policy with the Legal Defense Fund. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. Let me say this here, because we're about to do this interview. So in about 3 minutes, what's going to happen is I'm going to actually log off. I have to do Ari Melber's show on MSNBC. Michael will continue the conversation with the panel, and then I'll come back. So just letting y'all know that right now. So Demetria, walk us through the basis of this lawsuit.
Happy to do so. And thank you for having me on, Roland. As you mentioned before, this lawsuit that we challenge is challenging 3 of the executive orders that President Trump signed, all related to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and transgender people. And so in the lawsuit, we claim that the executive orders will severely limit the organization's abilities to actually provide some critical social and health services, such as HIV treatment, fair housing, counseling, equal employment opportunities, affordable credit, civil rights protection, and many, many others. And so this would harm countless of people across the United States, including Black people, other people of color, women, LGBTQ plus people, people with disabilities, just as was referenced earlier, people living with HIV. And so the lawsuit was filed on behalf of 3 nonprofit organizations. Some of them might be familiar with. National Urban League was one, National Fair Housing Alliance, as well as the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. And so it goes on in the lawsuit to claim that the administration is actually violating the organization's rights to free speech and due process rights, as well as engaging in actual intentional discrimination by using and enforcing the anti-equity orders. All right. Now, these 3 orders that we're challenging, they do some things. They terminate equity-related grants. All right. And they forbid federally funded entities from engaging in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs, and from recognizing the existence of transgender people. And so together, the orders actually reverse actual decades and decades of civil rights progress, folks. And also they pose an existential threat to organizations that actually advocate for civil rights and the rights of transgender people, people who are actually trying to help people get shelter and have services. So really critical rights that are impacted here in the lawsuit. And so we're hoping to get a favorable decision, but we just filed it this week.
But again, that's what their goal is. I mean, their goal is to actually, I did a piece, shortly after inauguration saying MAGA's goal is to defund Black America. They want to attack the civil rights and the economic rights infrastructure.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, and we know a lot of the work, for instance, that the National Urban League does, right? So they are the largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization that's committed to elevating the standard of living for Black Americans, as well as other underserved people. And also they're very, very out front about their support for people in the LGBT community. And so the work they do really tries to empower people economically, right? So just to your point, Roland, to disarm that is really hurting swaths of our people.
Okay, Demetria, this is Michael M. Hotep. So before I go to the panel with questions, one of the questions I had, because I've been following this and I read some of the executive orders. We know that Donald Trump rescinded Executive Order 11246, which is affirmative action dating back to President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1965. And oftentimes we hear in the African American community, well, the number one beneficiary of DEI are white women. OK, and we don't benefit that much from DEI, so it doesn't hurt the African American community. There's an article from blackenterprise.com that talks about how only 4% of diversity, equity, and inclusion jobs go to African Americans. So can you talk about how, maybe more specifically, the type of harm that will happen to the African American community if we can't get these executive orders from Trump rescinded when it deals with equity grants, when it deals with job opportunities, economic opportunities, things of that nature pertaining specifically to the African American community?
Absolutely. Happy to do so. So let's think about, I talked about the National Urban League, right? Let's talk about the National Fair Housing Alliance. The National Fair Housing Alliance is the country's only national civil rights organization that is dedicated solely to eliminating all forms of housing and lending discrimination. If anybody's been reading the newspaper in the last, let's say 2 years, you've heard about appraisal bias. This is one of the things that they focus on, right? And that appraisal bias is really, as I call it, appraisal discrimination, is really targeted at Black households, okay? And so if you take away the funding of this organization, you're crippling them from being able to do that type of work, okay? And so they've been doing longstanding outreach on these types of things, housing counseling that they provide people. They're looking at artificial intelligence as it relates to fair housing and housing discrimination. I would say out of the categories of fair housing complaints that are filed with the federal government, for instance, disability is up there. Most complaints are disability. But the second biggest group relates to race based on fair housing discrimination, right? And so if we cut off the legs of organizations like this because they are actually pushing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, then we're cutting off a lot of the supports that they give the Black community.
Okay, and I had another follow-up question. When you talk about equity grants, okay, give us more information, more details. What exactly are equity grants? How have these grants been able to help African-American organizations, things like that? Because a lot of times when people don't know that different policies exist, they don't miss it until it's gone. They feel the impact when it's gone, but don't really realize what it is, before it's taken away. So give us some more details on what exactly are equity grants and how do they help African-American organizations?
Well, if we think about it, I know you mentioned earlier, people felt as if in the employment space, right, that Black people were not benefiting that much. But if you think about it, there are organizations who simply, because of historic barriers, historic discrimination, simply are not able to get some of those opportunities that a lot of other organizations get, right? Because let's say, for instance, their focus is the Black community or their focus is some other marginalized community, right? And so grants and contracts, I will say, not often, but sometimes do really go to people who are going to target those communities. Okay. And so that's what I meant earlier when I said you kind of cut off the legs of the organizations that are specifically trying to help the Black community and other underserved communities. Those are the types of things we're talking about. Absolutely.
Oh, okay. I want to go to my panel here. We'll start with Matt. Start with the attorney on the panel. Matt, did you have a question for Demetria?
I sure do. I first have a comment. Thank you for the good work you're doing. This is not easy work, and I appreciate y'all carrying the mantle. And I kind of have a couple questions in that respect. So I'm interested particularly in the speech and how it's framed. I haven't read the lawsuit, of course, but is it essentially like a viewpoint discrimination argument, basically that because they're advocating for DEIA, the federal government is infringing on their speech, or is there some other way that that's being framed? And as it relates to the Fifth Amendment, I thought that was really interesting. That's where I thought you were going to go with the due process. Is there precedent in history in terms of the federal government being stopped or enjoined from certain actions that are, comparable to this under the Fifth Amendment? I'm asking because I haven't seen many examples, and I'd love to see kind of some of the precedent.
Yeah, I tell you that I'm not prepared to give you the examples at the very moment. But to your first question, which I believe was about the free speech piece of it, absolutely. Because see, these organizations that are plaintiffs in this case, they have a mission, right?
Right.
And
Right.
within their missions, they're focused on particular communities, particular type of discrimination, particular types of things that are exactly the things that the Trump administration is going after, right? And so that's the viewpoint that they have, that they share, and they publicly espouse what their mission is and what their points are, right? And so when we talk about free speech and the First Amendment, that gives you a sense of kind of what's at stake here.
Okay, Matt, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, actually, I did have a follow-up question. And Demetria, I'm sorry if I'm going too into the weeds, but I'm really interested in this. So, obviously, if this were between, let's say, two members of different states, you might use the 14th Amendment to say equal protection, right? Is there a corollary under the Fifth Amendment that allows you to say essentially that these organizations that are the plaintiffs are being treated differently than organizations that are not, espousing viewpoints that are offensive to the Trump administration? I mean, not under the due process clause, but I mean, under an equal protection theory, is there a way to allege it that way?
Well, I don't want to go outside the four corners of the complaint since it's just pending, and everybody's welcome to take a look at that on our website. But if you're talking about comparing these complainants to others who have others, let's say United Way, for example, and I don't want to point them out specifically, let's say a group like that helps everybody, right, without specifically focusing on issues of race. Those types of organizations are not likely to have their funding put at risk or taken away from them versus these types of organizations. So there's a big difference in how these organizations who espouse the need for civil rights, right, and the elimination of discrimination versus those who are silent on it. Big, huge difference there.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Next, I want to go to Zabora. Zabora, did you have a question for Demetria?
Yeah, I do a lot of work with individuals with disabilities, and just to think of how some of those equal protections are being impacted under how these executive orders are impacting those equal protection rights when it comes to things like the work opportunity tax credit, different research for research grants that find out how individuals with disabilities or how individuals with other minorities are being impacted by this. Do you think that this lawsuit will allow other individuals to be able to file lawsuits of their own? And how can we ensure that we are supporting them in the best ways that we can? And how much protection do they have under the ADA laws to protect them, to present a case that will allow them to really combat these executive orders?
I tell you, I'm so glad you touched on that, and I really appreciate your comments that you made it earlier. I would definitely plus up those. So, the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, is what she was talking about, folks. There's the American Disabilities Acts, there's Title VII, Title VI, all of these civil rights acts. Honestly, folks, there's a lot of misinformation and falsehoods that the president is spreading about what power he has with the pen under quote unquote laws that he's creating, right? These statutes have been on the books for absolute decades. And to the extent that these laws have protected people in the past, they should be protecting people in the future. And so while the four corners of this particular lawsuit speak to the issues I mentioned earlier, there are lots of other organizations looking at filing other types of lawsuits on other types of bases. And so when you talk about whether or not this particular lawsuit will protect people with disabilities, first, let's stop and say there's intersectionality, right? There are plenty of Black people, Black families across America who have a disability, right? And sometimes it impacts our people more than others. And so when we are talking about, in this case, making sure that organizations that support people with those issues, that is the way that would be helpful. But in terms of somebody protecting their individual rights under something like the American with Disabilities Act, that's yet to be seen. We'll have to see how that works out. And we have to see what the courts do, right? So far, I would give people a little bit of encouragement that we've seen some good decisions come out, some of these district courts, but let's see what the courts do.
Absolutely. All right, Zabora, thanks for your question. Now, Demetria, first of all, you mentioned your website. Give everybody your website, please.
Sure, NAACPLDF.org. When you go in there on the front page, you'll be able to see a statement about the case, and it'll link to the actual complaint as well as a shortened version to give people a little summary about the complaint if you don't want to read the whole complaint.
Okay. Now, when we talk about the disabled community, people with disabilities in America, you mentioned some of the civil rights legislation that deals with disabilities. Approximately how many people in America are classified as disabled or have a disability, and if you know, what percentage of that total number are made up of African Americans?
You know what? I am not prepared with those numbers. Happy to get it to you. But
that's fine.
You know, we are overrepresented. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah.
And you know why, though, right? Because we're overrepresented when it comes to health care, right?
Mm-hmm. With not having health care, not having health insurance. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Lack health insurance. So now, from my understanding and reading like various job applications, things like that, is diabetes classified as a disability? Yes, having diabetes?
I don't think I'm the right guest to answer that question for you.
Okay. All right. No problem. No problem. Another question that I had was I was looking at a statement from Janae Nelson from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And she said, quote, "The three orders we are challenging today perpetuate false and long-standing stereotypes that Black people and other underrepresented groups lack skills, talent, and merit, willfully ignoring the discriminatory barriers that prevent a true meritocracy from flourishing." So when we saw Donald Trump sign these executive orders, like rescinding Executive Order 11246, extending, and on day one in office, he also rescinded Executive Order 13985 that was put in place on the first day of the Biden-Harris administration. And that dealt with looking at how systemic racism permeated throughout all federal government departments. And they came up with 300 policies to deal with that and put that in place. Can you talk a little bit about this whole myth that somehow Black people are not qualified when it comes to having jobs, but automatically white people are automatically qualified? Whatever it is, they never talk about, well, what hate unqualified white people. Can you break that down for a minute, please?
Absolutely. And you know, this whole concept of quote unquote meritocracy is again, smoke and mirrors, and it's absolutely not true and not factual. When we look, though, the reality is we look at this is why we need diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs and initiatives. When we look at the unemployment rate, just looking at it from January of this year, right, the unemployment rate for Blacks is still higher than that of whites, right? So for whites, it's around 3-something%. For Blacks, it's 6-something%. But let me tell you something. That is not because we're lazy. That is because we're not capable. That is because of the historic barriers that we have dealt with. There's no secret to that. And they want you to believe that it's simply because of our lack of trying and that we're not qualified. Well, let me tell you something. We are qualified. When you look at the numbers and percentages of folks who are graduating some of our HBCUs, they're huge numbers. They're huge numbers. So we are sometimes more qualified than the next white person. So that is absolute fallacy, absolute fallacy.
And we see this being perpetuated, this meritocracy, and they'll invoke Dr. King, even at the Black History Month celebration that took place yesterday. Alveda King, Dr. King's niece, was there on day one when Donald Trump was doing these executive orders, rescinding 78 executive orders from President Biden. He said, we're going to make Dr. King's dream come true. But Dr. King was talking about dismantling white supremacy and racism in America. Okay. So give us, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, and even when we do get these positions, we are still making 20% less than the white person who has the same level of education that we do. And that's data that came straight from National Bureau of Economic Research.
Right. Yeah. So, on last Friday's show, when I was on last Friday on Roland Martin Unfiltered, I brought up Black Women's Equal Pay Day. And Black Women's Equal Pay Day takes place sometime in August. And it deals with the fact that it takes African-American women 20 months to make, on average, 20 months to make the same amount of money that it took the average white male 12 months to make. And African-American women on average lose out on about $1 million in lost earnings over their working career, approximately about 40 years. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I know Roland is on his way back. Give us that website again. And
sure, happy to do so.
Get back.
NAACPLDF.org. And let me just invite your listeners also to take the time to look at our report that we did when we analyzed Project 2025. They'll find that on our website as well. We analyzed it from the perspective of Project 2025 as it relates to the Black community. That's going to, like that, obviously we know already that that's a roadmap for what's to come in this administration and what we've seen already, but it really takes it from the perspective of the Black community.
Absolutely. And I did look at that. I've been on a few panels over the past few months dealing with Project 2025. And I did look at that information as well. And that was one of the questions I wrote down to ask, dealing with, we know there's been about 60 policies that Trump has put in place that come from Project 2025, but dealing with these executive orders, how does that, if you can give me, let me know quickly, maybe about 30 seconds, how does that line up with Project 2025, these various executive orders he's put in place?
Absolutely lines up. I mean, let's take the Department of Education, right? Because everybody's heard about how they're trying to dismantle the Department of Education. A lot of that is straight from the Project 2025 script. I call it a script, right? And so the things we're seeing, obviously we know the horrible things going on with federal workers as it relates to the federal government. But the things we're seeing, there's a letter that they issued last week at Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, full of falsehoods relating to the SFFA case, which directly deals with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in higher education. And they try to blow that out and make it act like it addresses all types of sectors. It does not. It is an absolute falsehood. That's how they try to distract us.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. And right now we're accepting investors in our $17 million round to revolutionize the future of social media. Today, for just $399, you can own 60 shares of stock in Fanbase at $6.65 a share. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. While the big platforms have grown too massive and disconnected from their users, Fanbase is building a platform where creators and users truly come first. We've already raised $4.8 million from everyday investors who believe in this vision, and now you can join them. This is your chance to invest in a social media tech company with over 1 million users that is disrupting media by allowing anyone to reach all of their following and monetize their content from day one. The market is changing, big platforms are failing to serve their users, and Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now. Invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the future of social media.